This is Encounter on VOA. Here's Carol Castiel.
Welcome to Encounter on the Voice of America. On this edition of the program, the crisis in Ethiopia deepens. This month marks the first anniversary of Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's military operation to drive back the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, who had seized military bases in Tigray, a provocative act meant to defy and weaken Abiy. According to The Economist magazine, quote, in less than 1 month, federal Ethiopian forces, backed by paramilitaries from the Amhara region, as well as Eritrean troops, had captured almost all of Tigray, including its capital, Mekelle, close quote. However, since then, the TPLF has rallied and, in an alliance with other armed opposition forces, such as the Oromo Liberation Army, appear poised to launch an assault on the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. In response, on November 2nd, Prime Minister Abiy declared a 6-month nationwide state of emergency and urged citizens to prepare to fight to defend the city. In light of the escalating violence, Washington advised all Americans to leave Ethiopia and cautioned against travel there. What began as a military operation 1 year ago has now morphed into a full-blown civil war without a clear resolution. This despite a parade of diplomats, from the U.S. Horn of Africa envoy Jeffrey Feltman to African Union envoy, former Nigerian President Obasanjo, to the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths, urging all sides to stand down and reach a lasting political solution. In a bid to pressure the Ethiopian government, the United States announced it would freeze duty-free access for Ethiopian goods under the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Several press reports indicate that Washington may also impose sanctions on officials if the warring parties do not negotiate. VOA News reports that the conflict has killed thousands of people, displaced several million from their homes, and left approximately 400,000 residents of Tigray facing famine. The Ethiopian government has blocked aid to Tigray and expelled 7 UN humanitarian officials, accusing them of meddling in the country's affairs. Well, for more on the political and humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia and its implications for the region, we turn to 2 retired top diplomats with extensive experience in sub-Saharan Africa. Tibor Nagy is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during the Trump administration. Among his many other senior diplomatic posts, Assistant Secretary Nagy served as U.S. Ambassador to Guinea and to Ethiopia. And Ambassador Donald Booth, he was U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia, Liberia, and Zambia. He also served as Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan. And both gentlemen join me via Microsoft Teams. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good to be here.
We're honored to have you both. Let me begin with you, Assistant Secretary Nagy. What is your assessment of the situation in Ethiopia? Could you have ever imagined that Ethiopia, known as a bulwark of relative stability in the Horn and a strong ally of the United States, could reach this perilous moment?
No, actually not, because Ethiopia was kind of the star of Africa in 2019 and much of 2020. And we were counting on Ethiopia to provide stability in the entire Horn of Africa region. And the reforms that Prime Minister Abiy undertook, both internally and externally, were quite remarkable, especially given Ethiopia's history. So, no, it's very unfortunate. And, I consider to call this maybe one of the most needless wars in history.
And Ambassador Booth, let me get your take with regard to this incredible moment we're witnessing.
Well, I think what we're seeing is Ethiopian history playing itself out again in a similar mode to the past. Ethiopia has been a country which unfortunately has had periods of greatness, generally under strong rulers, and they have either come under attack externally or from their peripheries, and at some point the strong central state tends to collapse. So what we're seeing here really is Ethiopians struggling with the fundamental issue of the nature, I think, of the Ethiopian state. And only Ethiopians can really determine what the nature of that state is going to be. And I think our fervent hope, and that of all of its neighbors in Africa and in the international community, is that they can grapple with this question of the nature of the Ethiopian state peacefully rather than through conflict.
Well, turning back to you, Ambassador Nagy, speaking of the nature of the Ethiopian state, it was my impression that it was a very proud and still is obviously a very proud country. It doesn't have any history of colonialism, and yet we're seeing all these ethnic tensions coming to the fore between Tigrayans, Amhara group, Oromo. How do you think this has come about? Why has this come about? And have you seen, in your experience, this type of ethnic animosity when you were serving?
Well, here's the thing. Ethiopia, I always say in my speeches, is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa that's a product of history and geography and not the European colonizers standing around a map of Africa in Berlin and making, marks on that map. So Ethiopia is a 2,000+ year old state and culture. It has gone through, as Don says, cataclysmic periods in its history. In the most recent history, the emperor and then the successor Marxist regime of Mengistu, both with a strong central government. And then when Mengistu was chased from power, the Tigrayan and the Eritrean-led rebel forces that took over the country went to what they called ethnic federalism. It was an experiment. There was good philosophical substance behind it, but it did not work out very well. Ethnic federalism works in a place like Switzerland, where you have ethnicities that are hostile to each other sharing the wealth. But in Ethiopia, since they were basically sharing poverty, it just went in a different direction. And when Prime Minister Abiy came in, he wanted to go back to much more the unitary state instead of working on the separate ethnicities.
Turning back to you, Ambassador Donald Booth, how do you see these ethnic tensions coming to the fore, and do you foresee getting out of this mess?
Well, during my time as ambassador in Ethiopia, I managed to get to all of the states of Ethiopia, and it's an incredibly diverse country. I think what we've seen in recent times is political leaders using ethnicity as a basis for stirring up local support. And this has exacerbated the problems in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a diverse state, and this is something that Meles grappled with when he came up with the idea of ethnic federalism. Was a way to have a unified state, but yet recognizing the differences within the state. As Tibor has said, that did not work out. This generated a lot of antagonism from other ethnic groups. And so what Ethiopians need to do is they really need to, again, go back to the drawing board and figure out how they can live together in peace, recognizing their diversity.
So back to you, Ambassador Nagy. Let's fast forward to where we stand today. We have now this alliance of opposition groups led by the TPLF, partnering with the Oromo Liberation Army and a number of other groups, really at the gates of Addis Ababa. The international community is pressing for a ceasefire, for talks, and yet there's such animosity. You ask both sides, whether it's Prime Minister Abiy or the Tigray leaders, and they're just like, we can't talk to the other side. Are we at the brink of an all-out war?
I don't believe so. If you look at Ethiopian history, there have been these kinds of struggles before, as Don said. I don't want to say that the Tigrayans are at the gates of Addis Ababa. It's like having a force at Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C. is quite a ways away. And I'm also not sure that the Tigrayans really want to have a battle for Addis Ababa. That's one. Another point is the so-called coalition. It's certainly not a coalition of equals. It is a coalition of basically the TPLF, and it resembles the type of quote-unquote coalition that took over Ethiopia from the Marxist government when the Tigrayans put themselves into a preeminent position. So I think putting pressure on Addis is a tactic for the Tigrayans, but as I said, I think they want to use it as a leverage, much like, say, nuclear-armed states use nuclear weapons, and they never want to actually blow them up.
Ambassador Booth, do you see it that way as well, that the Tigrayans and their allies in this so-called alliance don't really want war, but they want to use their approach to Addis Ababa as a tactic, as leverage in their conflict with the government?
Well, I agree with Tibor. I don't think that the TPLF is looking for a pitched battle. This would not be like when they moved in at the collapse of the Derg back in 1991, when they did not have to fight for the capital. The Derg was so hated that they were actually welcomed there with some fear and trepidation, but generally welcomed. I think they realized that would not be the case this time. I think much more likely they would try to, in effect, do to the government in Addis what the government has done to them, which is basically try to isolate the sources of supply by trying to cut or at least hinder supplies coming in from Djibouti. Don't forget that everything comes in over one road, one railroad, one pipeline from Djibouti. The entire economy depends on access to the port of Djibouti. So I don't think that we're going to see a pitched battle for Addis. I certainly hope we don't. But the point is that the government, by imposing a blockade on Tigray, plus all of the atrocities that were committed in the early days of the fighting, really failed to win any hearts and minds in Tigray, and therefore united Tigrayans behind the TPLF, which enabled them then to regroup and become the military power that they have become, and therefore able to pose a threat to neighboring areas of Amhara, Afar, and now moving toward Addis, and committing their own atrocities in the process. So the three things that the international community has been calling for are basically ceasefire, start talking, and allow humanitarian access.
How to get out of this military standoff. We just spoke with Ambassador Booth, who summarized what the international community is asking for, which is a ceasefire, humanitarian access, and a dialogue. So back to you, Ambassador Nagy. How are the interlocutors? For example, U.S. envoy to the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, former Nigerian President Obasanjo, and Martin Griffiths of the UN doing? Are they making any headway, in your view, with the belligerent parties?
I think, as Don said earlier, the solution is going to come from within, not from without. We could have 100 different envoys, all extremely capable. I don't think at this point they would make a hill of beans difference. The current international alignment is not sufficient to put pressure on the parties to stop fighting, unfortunately, because even though the West is basically united, there are some very important players missing. For example, if we had a contact group to support former President Obasanjo's AU effort that consisted of, say, the United States, China, and somebody from the Gulf or even Turkey, that would be a much more powerful voice than simply having the West speaking up and almost issuing a statement a day. The Chinese really matter here. They're silent. They copped out of this with their, no interference in internal affairs kind of statement. And also missing from the public dialogue, unfortunately, are the Middle East countries and a country like Turkey. That is what it would take because, as Don said, we could stop the war today. This could be solved this week with an immediate ceasefire, an immediate opening up of Tigray to humanitarian assistance, and undertaking a negotiation on the future status of Ethiopia and the status of those areas which the Amhara reoccupied from Tigray. So it could be done very easily and quickly.
Well, that's a fascinating response. So back to you, Ambassador Booth. What do you say with regard to the various interlocutors? Do you also agree that they're simply insufficient and that we should perhaps consider a contact group like Assistant Secretary Nagy just suggested, consisting of the United States, China, and maybe Turkey, somebody from the Middle East? And by the way, I would like to get your take on those actors, to what extent maybe the UAE is involved in a good or negative way.
Well, I fully agree with Tibor. I think we have excellent work being done by our envoy, Jeff Feltman. I know President Obasanjo and the work that he's done in the past. I think he's very competent and very dedicated to what he's trying to do, but it's not sufficient to convince the Ethiopians. And I will go back to remind people that Ethiopians are proud and independent people, and they are not the most receptive, if you will, to advice from outsiders. They can be very hard-headed. And so we do need more than just the talk. I think one of the things that we generally naturally pivot to is, well, if they won't listen to us, we'll sanction them. And we have threatened individual sanctions. I don't think that travel and even financial sanctions against leaders from Ethiopia is going to sway their thinking one bit. And the other thing we've done is we've suspended AGOA trade preferences. Now, this sends a great signal, but one of the things that I've seen over my career is it's a lot easier to impose sanctions and to take away privileges than it is to ever restore the privileges. And Ethiopia is certainly going to need our support when it gets its act together and figures out how it's going to live in peace. And I hope that we will be able to respond very quickly once they have achieved that political solution that only they can bring about. I'd also like to interject here, though. You asked about the UAE. I do agree with Tibor. I think a contact group is an excellent idea. Tibor organized the Friends of Sudan group at the time of the Sudanese revolution, which I think was instrumental in getting that country to agree on a constitutional declaration and a sharing of power between the military and the civilians, which unfortunately has recently collapsed, as we know. But there's another urgency, and that is that the longer an ethnic-based war goes on, the harder it is to ever resolve it and to heal those wounds. This is something that struck me at the beginning of the South Sudan conflict in 2013 when I advised President Kiir that he was telling me it was not an ethnic conflict. And I said, it's very much an ethnic conflict. And indeed, it has become entrenched in that regard. We don't want to see that happen in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was a country that was growing at almost 10% a year, its economy. It had a government that really was trying to attract investment, build infrastructure, improve the health and education of its people. And that's what Ethiopians, I think, really want, to be able to get back to a situation where instead of fighting each other, they can spend their energy and their resources with the help of their international friends to improve the opportunities for their children and future generations of Ethiopians.
Absolutely. And as we close, back to you, Assistant Secretary Nagy, I think we would be remiss if we didn't speak a bit about the role of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, a gentleman known as a reformer. He was a Nobel laureate, turned much more authoritarian. He is the head of state. How much responsibility does he bear for this continuing conflict, for the inability to try to come to a negotiated solution?
Yeah, I'll talk about Abiy in a moment, but I just wanted to very strongly second one thing that Don said. The human-to-human aspects of this conflict are just as serious in many respects as the humanitarian emergency for the long term, and the Ethiopian diaspora around the world has unfortunately been contributing to the poison in the atmosphere. In addition to a contact group to support former President Obasanjo, I was thinking it might make a lot of sense to give the EU a role. The EU working together with this wonderful organization that the Vatican has called Zena, to maybe convene a conference of the leading religious leaders from the entire region, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Tigray, to start working together to start healing this huge humanitarian hatred. And I can't call it anything but hatred, the vituperative hatred that has grown up in the what we call the Habasha community around the world. Prime Minister Abiy, you talked about his Nobel Prize earlier. When the Nobel Prize was given to him, I felt very strongly he deserved it for the remarkable advances that he had made externally and internally. Since then, of course, it has gone in a completely different direction. Ethiopian leaders tend to be even more stubborn than the populations. This applied certainly to Meles, to his predecessors, and it applies to Abiy. He feels very, very strongly that he's going in a certain direction, and that's the direction he's going to go in.
So turning to you, Ambassador Donald Booth, you get the last word.
I agree with Tibor on the role of the diaspora. Don't forget they came here in waves. In front of the State Department, it used to be the anti-TPLF demonstrations on an almost daily basis. Over the last year, it's been Tigrayans protesting against the Abiy government. Really, I think what Prime Minister Abiy tried to do in creating a national party, he was trying to create a unified, unitary state with a strong central government, moving away from the federalist approach. The international community, I think, does have in its own interest the need to help Ethiopians begin that dialogue, but certainly it has to be up to Ethiopians to figure out what the answer is. I've seen in too many countries that I've served in over my 40-plus year career where involvement of an outsider in somebody's civil war has long-term consequences. I can remember being told 40 years after the Greek Civil War how the United States had played such a corrosive role. Even though we saved the country from becoming a Stalinist satellite, there were those who felt that we had been against those seeking social justice and were resented for that. And so outsiders have to be very careful not to try to formulate what the answer is for Ethiopians, but simply to give them space to grapple with that themselves and then help them put the pieces back together. Because Ethiopia is critical for stability in the Horn of Africa, and we have to redouble our efforts once they do find a way to live together again in peace.
Gentlemen, I hope all parties are listening to your excellent recommendations and that we will see a much more stable and peaceful Ethiopia and Horn of Africa.